what I'm going to talk about is, well, I've got a few things to talk about, and the biggest of them is a study that was done by the National Renewable Energy Lab in Colorado on interconnecting our eastern and western grids in the United States. So I'm going to start talking about that. I'll talk about a couple other things as well. So interconnection seam study, I mentioned that. There's a feature that kind of goes along with this that's being developed in Plexus at present called Geographic Decomposition. So I'm going to give you a little bit of a teaser about what that might be. It doesn't exist yet, but David's working on it, right, David? He kind of shook his head at me. And then I'm also going to tell you about the North American Renewable Integration Study, which is related to the interconnection seam study. I'll show you some kaleidoscope visualizations, which are some Plexus-oriented visualizations that might be interesting to you. And then there's a bullet item that I neglected to put on here, which is resiliency studies. So we're going to take a little tour of some things that are going on with Plexus in the United States. So the National Renewable Energy Lab, funded by the Department of Energy, has been using Plexus since about 2012. And they use Plexus on desktop machines for like testing and whatnot, but they also have a high-performance computing cluster. Their Peregrine HPC, which has, last I heard, it has about 2,500 compute nodes. It takes up, a moderately large building. It's liquid cooled too, so it's really cool to kind of see it through the glass. If you wanted to find out more information about this study, you can go to this link, and this presentation will be provided along with the other presentations later. But just to tell you a little bit about the US grid, there are basically three pieces of the US grid. There's what we call the Eastern Interconnect, which is a very large grid on its own. There's the Western Interconnect, which is separated roughly at the Rocky Mountains. And then there's the Electric Reliability Council of Texas, because of course, Texas is its own country. That's a joke. So between those three interconnections right now, on the scale of things, not very much electricity changes across those boundaries. And the boundaries are DC back-to-backs for the most part. And what that means is that they function with no synchronization between the three grids. So this study, the interconnection seam study, is going to look at tying together with a greater strength the eastern and the western grid. And also looking at what the valuation of such a connection would be. Now, NREL, because it's the National Renewable Energy Lab, one of the things that they're always looking to do is make assumptions around renewable build-out, and also looking for opportunities to use existing resources to integrate more renewables. And we'll get to see some of that as we look at some maps in a minute, like right now. So here's some of those DC back-to-backs I was telling you about. They're represented between the western and the eastern grid right here. I didn't represent the DC back-to-backs between the eastern grid and Texas, but there's more of them there. And so right now, each of those back-to-backs that you're seeing there has about 200 megawatts of transfer capability. And these are aging pieces of infrastructure. Very often, you can't really rely on them for any power transfer because they have long periods of maintenance due to the fact that they are 40 to 50 years old for the most part and haven't really been maintained for the level of transfer capability that they could potentially have. Now, yeah, that's an interesting question. So my colleague Aaron Bloom, when he discusses this topic, he likes to give the whole history of this. I mean, a question exists, which is, why are they even there at all, right? Well, why have we got these DC back-to-backs? And the interesting history of the development of the grid is this area where that seam is one of the least populated parts of the country. So for a very long period of time, there was really no electric power demand, and that was one of the last places to fully electrify in terms of overall electric power demand. So why do the DC back-to-backs exist? Well, in the early part of the 20th century, yeah, we have to go back 100 years. In the very early part of the 20th century, the US government had developed this idea that the eastern and western grids ought to be connected with each other. And the DC back-to-backs were the first step in that process. And if you look back at the documentation that comes from that period of time, they had the strong expectation that they would have one synchronous grid connecting both parts of the country. And it just never happened for a variety of political reasons. So one of the reasons that this was being explored as long ago as 100 years ago is because at the time, hydroelectric power was the prevailing form of power production in this particular part of the country. And they were building lots of power projects up in this area that's just to the right of the green line. And then there was a rapidly growing demand in the far western part of the United States. So there's this idea that these federal power projects could end up funneling some of their output to the west. But they never actually managed to do that in any sizable amount. And so now the question comes back around, what could we possibly gain by interconnecting these more strongly? And one of the questions that they were exploring along the way was, do we have one synchronous grid here, or do we have two not synchronous grids that are connected with stronger DC back-to-backs? Or maybe even instead of having a bunch of DC back-to-backs like this, we build a lot longer DC lines to connect load to load or generation to load in either direction. So, I mean, there's a lot of different possibilities about how you could go about this. This is about the team that was probably the driving force for this project. And so there's a consortium of national laboratories, and then two of the biggest independent system operators that would be most directly affected by this. The Southwest Power Pool and the Mid-Continent Independent System Operator, which operate more or less in that region. And then the Western Area Power Administration is the operator of all those hydro projects in the central north that I was telling you about a minute ago. So then they also had a technical review committee, as one does when one is creating a gigantic project like this, and they had representatives from dozens of utilities, basically all of the system operators, although you'll notice that PJM, our largest single RTO, is not on the list. It wasn't that they weren't interested, they're just far away from that boundary. And then Energy Exemplar was also a member of this particular technical review committee. So I participated in that myself. All right, so now I've got a complicated map to show you that has a lot of different information on it, so let's unpack this. First of all, the large or smallish red dots represent major areas of population, i.e. load. The blue dots represent large hydropower projects. The gray areas represent fossil resources, and by fossil resource, we mostly mean coal and natural gas production. And there are a large number, of course, of coal and natural gas-fired power plants in areas that are adjacent to those coal and natural gas production areas, but we also have a very robust gas pipeline infrastructure as well. And then we've got the shaded blue areas that kind of run from the north to the south, and those are potential for wind power resource. So here we're talking about energy resource availability or potential. And then across the south part of the country, we have the most promising solar power resources. And what we notice about these renewable resource opportunities is that they roughly straddle that seam. And as we think about that, one of the things that we know is valuable when we talk about these kind of intermittent renewable resources is geographic diversity. So, for example, if you were somehow in California able to benefit from the fact that the sun rises in Florida at your 4 o'clock in the morning, and you could get solar power at 4 a.m., and then if New York could get wind power at, or well, any time of day really, but if New York could get solar power at 9 p.m. or 10 p.m., you solve a problem that nobody's really even thinking about. That geographic diversity also means that some of the variations from one region to another would start to cancel each other out a little bit more. So you can see why one might be motivated to see if one can strengthen the ability to move power from side to side in this very broad country. So I'm going to talk about a couple of the design options that they came to regarding how to strengthen these. And I mentioned one of them is just to make these DC back-to-backs more robust. So instead of having roughly 200 megawatts of transfer capability apiece, 1,000 or 1,200 or something like that. Then instead of having a grand total of around 1,200 megawatts of east to west transfer capability, you've got 7,200 or 8,400. So that's a fairly substantial improvement. You can see that there are 7 of them here, which is why I'm saying those numbers. That's one possibility. But one of the things that's difficult about this is that if you want to be able to do this, you're going to have a significant amount of AC structure build out on either side of the back-to-backs. And the AC grid in this area and this area are pretty sparse. So the amount of AC investment that would be required to get power to the DC back-to-backs in the first place is fairly large still. And it doesn't directly benefit congestion in any specific region in that area, so cost allocation then becomes a problem. This is another possible approach to strengthening the connection between east and west, which is to run extremely long DC interties from one area of the country to another. And this, obviously, DC interties have their challenges, but in terms of controllability, they're high. And also, this is also, encouraging people to develop projects that would also take a part of their revenue from zones adjacent. And you can see here that the representation of the amount of AC infrastructure build-out is less than it was in the earlier picture. You've got a little bit that you've got to do to the further east and farther west, but you're getting power to load more immediately. All right, so it's charts like these that people spend a lot of time making, and I'm going to try to skip over most of the details here. But basically, the deal was NREL had a Western model and an Eastern model. They stuck them together. Surprise, surprise. And then they updated the data, and then they put together their scenarios, and then they ran all their scenarios to get results for benefit analysis for all of these. Why did they use Plexos for this? Because there isn't any other tool on the market that's able to get the level of granularity of output that they were looking for. And they wanted to really be able to zoom in on production cost. So what kind of level of granularity are we talking about? We're talking about a transmission problem that had 98,000 nodes represented, more than 100,000 lines, more than 12,000 generators. It's a massive system. I don't know of any system that's ever been modeled that's larger than this. The total generation capacity for this east-west grid is around It's around 380,000 megawatts of generation. So it's a pretty big grid. Yeah, and you know, they threw in Canada just for fun. All right, so what kind of results did they get out of this? The results, so they're categorized for design 2A and design 2B. Design 3 was a full AC synchronous grid, but the cost and the political will to build this, my opinion, is that it's relatively low in terms of buildability. So I focused more interest on these two. This one requires a lower level of investment. But what you can see is that wind power ends up being a big winner when you link the two grids together. And interestingly enough, when you link together the DC back-to-backs, that gives you almost as much benefit as the longer DC interties did, partly because a lot of the wind generation is right next to that seam, right? So you're getting most of the benefit just by having a stronger linkage. And where do we see declining value? You see that there's less need for nuclear power generation than there was, although that's a little sliver. The color coding, it didn't turn out quite right, but this kind of dark shaded area is coal-fired power. It's not storage. They look kind of similar in color. Okay. And so you see that there are a lot of opportunities for shifting the overall structure of the grid and shifting the overall the overall portfolio mix of power production. Now, on the left-hand side, we're talking about just taking our current set of carbon and renewable policies forward into the future. On the right here, they called it their carbon policy, and what they meant by their carbon policy was that they're looking at a scenario where they have a higher rate of reduction of carbon production. And so under those circumstances, there was an even larger shift toward renewable generation sources. And if you've made the assumption that you have this more aggressive carbon policy, and you're going to do it with or without these strengthenings of the east-west connection, you're also going to see in a second that if you have that assumption to begin with, the savings that you have from doing that are bigger. So here, with either of these two designs, this is billions of dollars, so saving about $1 billion a year with current renewable policies by adding this grid. And that's including the cost to build. So that's an all-in savings. And then over here in the carbon policy world, where we have more aggressive standards for the removal of carbon from the output of our fleet, you see that there's $3.5 to almost $4 billion of savings a year. So this is really valuable toward a more aggressive policy for carbon reduction. Interesting thing is that you don't see as much of a difference between the AC strengthening benefit and having a synchronous grid. It's not making much of a difference. In fact, it's a little bit less. All right, well, I'm going to skip ahead to talk about the thing that NREL did to make this kind of large-scale simulation a little bit easier and computationally less complex, which is the notion of geographic decomposition. And the basic principle of geographic decomposition is that you've got all of these grid segments all over the country. Now, I know that this is a very busy slide. I talked to those guys about how hard this is to look at, and they were like, oh, but it was a lot of fun to put together. And I'm like, well, we still probably need to do a little bit better. But basically the idea here is that you've got transfers between different regions in your grid. And what you want to do is simulate the friction between adjacent markets, right? You also want to simulate the fact that they're not being fully co-optimized because they have different operational control centers, and those different operational control centers are not 100% coordinated. So the idea is that you're going to do perhaps a unit commitment in this blue area, and this red area, and you're going to rely on the fact that there is some interconnection between them, but that you don't have perfect capability to do that. And then what you're gonna do is then when you run in the short-term simulation, you're going to separate out the problems, and you're going to isolate this piece of it and this piece of it when you run the short-term model. And then in a longer term, like an MT schedule sort of situation, you would be computing what the power flows between adjacent regions are. And what that means is that you're chunking this large-scale problem into a lot of much smaller problems, which means that the individual problem size is much smaller. It means the computational complexity of each piece of that is much smaller, and you get faster runtime, more or less. That's the general idea here. Any question about that before I move on? It means you can parallelize, but it also means, I mean, even if you couldn't parallelize, if you were doing them sequentially, you're going to remove a lot of the coupling between adjacent regions, so your problem size overall is smaller even if you were to do it sequentially. Yeah. So, yeah, so NREL, when they implemented their version of it, they built out these power flows and identified how much native load or native generation each region was going to produce, and then they separated the problem after they did that. That makes sense? So then you take that basic principle of problem size reduction, and then you simulate on smaller pieces of the overall model. We're working to implement something along these lines in Plexos right now, and David's going to give me an update when he's calmed down about where we stand on that, right, David? I think he's giving me a dirty look, but can't tell. So this kind of reiterates what I was mentioning just a minute ago. Reducing the unit commitment problem sizes, reducing the overall problem size, and actually an important sort of outcome of this is that this is going to be somewhat better at being able to simulate market friction between adjacent regions. Okay? And we're working on it. Yeah. Here's another one I wanted to tell you about, which is the North American Renewable Integration Study. NREL decided that it wasn't enough to make the largest grid ever. They decided that they wanted to add Mexico and all of Canada. Now, as one of our speakers earlier today alluded, sometimes elections can have an impact on what policies you're allowed to study. I don't know, maybe you've heard about our trade negotiations with Canada and Mexico. I think that this study, which was conceived in a time when there was less uncertainty around such things, may have hit a couple little snags along the way. Technically, it's still, no problem. But it was a cooperation between Canada, Mexico, and the US, East, West, and Texas. So there were, again, this is a joke, but there were 4 countries involved. So these are the organizations that were collaborating there, and there's a link to the study if you have some curiosity about it. But the study is sort of on hold at the minute. I'm going to tell you about it because they can't stop me. So the statement of goals was to look at modernizing the power system overall and facilitating additional integration of wind, solar, hydropower, and natural gas across borders. So in Mexico, they have quite a lot of interest in having access to North American gas markets, the US and Canada gas markets, because there's a very rich pipeline infrastructure there. And Mexico has a great need for natural gas in addition to all these issues with renewable power. And the idea of this was to allow further collaboration. This is the actual mission statement of the project. And that's all I can tell you about that because We don't have any results yet. But instead, I'm going to shift to telling you about Kaleidoscope, which is a tool that NREL developed, which allows you to create different kinds of visualizations. And it can be a little overwhelming to look at it at first, but I'm just going to kind of flip to the next slide and show you what we're talking about. Okay, so first of all, this map, what this map is representing is, obviously the United States and Canada minus Texas, and minus also Alaska and Hawaii, which, we don't have any direct interconnection with. But then it's representing all of the various resource types by technology. And then over here, it's also representing, the same thing. And then the arrows that are on the actual map themselves, those arrows are representing generally flows between adjacent areas. And then over here, these little wheels, what they're representing is both the direction and the magnitude of flow between adjacent areas. And if we were at NREL right now, they have a video of this, and you can see it animated in live. And so you can kind of get a sense of how the system evolves over time. I didn't do that because the video clip that they circulate is something like 1.2 gigabytes. So I just didn't feel like it. But the thing that's really neat about this is that after you get accustomed to these wheel diagrams, it's actually very rich with information. And it tells you a lot about what technologies are being used to generate. And another thing that's interesting about the geographic diversity of the intermittent renewable resources is that as they run the animation, you can actually see the sun rising across the east coast of the United States all the way across to the west coast. And then it's easier to imagine how a stronger seam between the two halves of the country would be beneficial to flows of power from one side to the other, especially of renewable resources. And the reason I'm pointing this out to you at all is because NREL has made all the code for Kaleidoscope public. So if you wanted to take Kaleidoscope and implement it at your organization, that's how you do it, kind of. I mean, there's a little bit more to it than that, but that's where all the code lives. So you can do it. And then the last thing I want to talk to you about was fuel security. So on the 29th of September in 2017, Secretary Rick Perry, Secretary of the Department of Energy, released a statement about a notice of public rulemaking, is what they call it. If you have spent any time talking with people that obsess about such things, they call it the DOE NOPR, Notice of Public Rulemaking. That's what that stands for. And he introduced to the United States a word that I apparently didn't include in this actual quote. Oh, there it is now. He introduced the word resilient. The word resilient wasn't necessarily part of our vocabulary until this announcement came out. And here he describes what he thinks resiliency is, and the notion of on-site reserves of fuel plays an important role in his estimation. So then a little bit more about what we kind of generally believe resiliency is. The idea of fuel delivery security, and then resistance to a variety of different kinds of disturbances of our electric power grid. And one of the kinds of disturbances we could be talking about would be extreme weather. We had this polar vortex phenomenon in 2014 where polar air from literally the North Pole came down into the continental US. And as far south as Atlanta, they had far below freezing temperatures. So this is one of the kinds of things that they were meaning to include, and one of the things that Secretary Perry called out in his Notice of Public Rulemaking, but also they were worried about things like the deliverability of natural gas, pipeline failures, or other reasons that the natural gas infrastructure wouldn't be able to deliver power, including pipeline constraints. And also general grid failures. So it's part reliability, but the idea of resiliency is the idea mostly that you have fuel sources that are on site to the generator, so that delivery is no longer a factor in grid instability. So the DOE NOPR that I mentioned was communicated to the Federal Electrical Reliability Council. This is a very boring story, I realize, but it's not boring in the sense that it noted all the concerns that I just mentioned and a whole lot of other ones. And then FERC fired back within 3 months saying, no, we're not going to do this. And they decided to kick it over to the independent system operators. And that's what this last bit over here is about. Okay, so that's about 4 months later. And so then the independent system operators needed to start to formulate a reply to this. And nobody had ever really addressed the question of how to value fuel delivery security, because it hadn't really been much of an issue except for an extreme weather phenomena or fuel delivery problems that oftentimes occur in New England during the dead of winter. And then what they wanted to do was try to examine all the possible sources of fuel security issues, and then they used Plexus to evaluate all of them, or a lot of the ones that they uncovered. So these are some of the kinds of scenarios that they analyzed. There's a couple things I want to draw your attention to. First of all, this is for PJM, and their extreme load scenario is one where load reached almost 150,000 megawatts, to give you a scale of the problem. And that's their 95% case. And then, situations where they had gas that was 62% available, which is kind of the business as usual case, versus 0% availability due to a pipeline incident or something of that sense. Then also how much refueling is going to be required if we have to truck in resources. Pipeline disruptions, pipeline disruption, high impact. I mean, they've just got a whole bunch of different combinations of different scenarios in which there could be disruptions to the grid. And they ran them all. And this is their conclusion. And this is a PJM slide. The last one was as well. This isn't my slide. But this is their conclusion. They don't have any immediate threat to the reliability of the PJM RTO. And they created all these very highly stressed scenarios. But the interesting thing about this, and one of the reasons that I'm talking to you about it at all, is that they'd never studied this at all until starting 6 months ago. And they went from 6 months ago never having actually done a proper study of it to having done a proper study of it and gotten fairly conclusive results in Plexus in a 6-month window, which is pretty impressive to me, especially given the number of different things that they were looking at.